started? Good morning. Exciting news. The back of my head was nominated for a Webby, which is my way of reminding you that we are being streamed once again. We're going to start with our briefing this morning, which is from Casey Anderson, Chair of the Montgomery County Planning Board. Chairman Anderson, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. So I should start by saying this is like at the beginning of a book when you say, all the errors are mine and all the credit goes to other people if I say something smart. Our crack research staff has prepared most of the data you see in these slides, but the interpretation being given to them are all my responsibility. Just wanted to make that clear. Last year I gave a presentation that was more comprehensive about where land use and transportation planning fits into demographic change, economic development, and related issues. This year I wanted to focus a little bit more closely on just giving you some updated data points on the housing market and also on the relationship between development and schools, because I know that's an issue that's of perennial interest in Annapolis as well as back in Montgomery County. So with that, I'll get started. The first slide you just have in front of you, it says we're growing more slowly. This is very similar to the slide I showed last year, and the point here is that our growth rates in terms of population are pretty flat. In fact, if we were growing any more slowly, you might say we'd be stagnant. The next slide shows what that means in total number of people. Even though the growth rate is relatively slow, we still have a couple 100,000 more people coming here over the next 20 years or so. So a lot of people have to be accommodated, even though we don't have very rapid growth. The next slide shows the pace of residential construction. And this is a bit of a complicated chart. It says residential building is not keeping up with demand. I think this is maybe one of the most important pieces of data to try to understand, because it's a little bit contrary to what most people think. A lot of people perceive that development is happening quickly. We have a lot of development activity, particularly residential development. And in fact, that's not the case. We see a lot of construction cranes on Wisconsin Avenue, Bethesda, White Flint, even in places like Germantown, Silver Spring, and increasingly places like Wheat. But we don't have a lot of greenfield development. We don't have some of the development of 500 houses on 200 acres that until recently was farmland. So while the development is much more visible today, the overall level of development activity is actually pretty flat, and that's causing some serious issues with the supply of housing. I want to just take a second to look at this chart to explain what it means. These bars that you see are the total number of dwelling units receiving building permits every year since 1994. The top dashed line shows the 20-year average, which is just under 3,500 units a year receive building permits. Over the second dashed line under that shows the average for the last 10 years, which is more like 2,400 units, under 2,500 units a year. And so since the recession, that shows that housing production has been well off the historic pace, even though jobs and population have increased pretty much at the same rate they were increasing before. So we have constrained housing supply, even as you have jobs and population growth, as a recipe for problems with housing affordability. The next slide is a new set of data that our research team found. We asked them to look at how many multifamily properties have been redeveloped, because I think there's the conventional wisdom that says that when multifamily properties are upzoned, that they get torn down and existing market rate affordable units are replaced by luxury high-rise condominiums or apartments. What our research staff found was they've only been able to locate 6 multifamily properties in the last 29 years that have been redeveloped into additional new multifamily houses. And you can see from this chart that that's actually produced, because 2 of those 6 were owned by affordable housing providers, HOC in one case and Montgomery Housing Partnership in the other. The net effect of those 6 projects we're developing has actually been to increase the number of regulated affordable units, while also producing a pretty significant increase in the total number of housing units on those pieces of land. So contrary to what you would believe, we're not seeing really hardly any redevelopment of multifamily, certainly not replacement of market rate affordable with luxury product. And in fact, we're seeing that the few cases in which that's happened, the net effect has been to increase pretty significantly the number of regulated affordable units that are available on that property. The next slide looks at, more specifically, single-family units and teardowns. We do see quite a bit of teardown activity, especially in Bethesda. About 4,400 single-family houses have been torn down since 1990 and replaced with other single-family homes. And you could look at this in some ways as displacement of affluent people with even more affluent people in some cases.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. And, well, you might not view that as an affordable housing problem because the people who are selling their houses for teardowns have another place to live, and they're getting a check and they're moving somewhere else. It's still contributing, I'm sorry, it's still contributing. How's that?
Just keep going, Sarah will work on it.
Okay, I'll try to speak loudly.
Thank you.
The phenomenon of teardowns really does create a problem in terms of making places like the single-family residential neighborhoods around Bethesda in particular less affordable. It's not so much an issue of people who are making 60 to 80% of area median income, which is mostly the focus of our MPU program, but nonetheless it aggravates the affordability problem. And I guess what I really want to highlight about this is that this is not an issue of upzoning, but in fact a situation where the only thing that can be built on those properties is another single-family house, and that tends to create incentives to build McMansions and to create the largest, most expensive house that could be accommodated on the site. The next slide is just a teaser of one of the things that we tried to do to address this, which is missing middle housing. That is to say, everything between, at the one end of the spectrum, single-family houses, and mid-rise or even garden-style apartment complexes. Things like duplexes, triplexes, 2/2s, these kind of housing types, which can provide the opportunity for moderate intensification of land use, even in some of the areas that are not appropriate for large apartment buildings, that can take a little bit of pressure off of the market and prices for some of the housing in neighborhoods that in the past have been entry-level neighborhoods or neighborhoods that at least that were affordable to a broad range of people. Thank you. Try this one now. Is that better? Yes. Thanks for bearing with me. The next set of slides concerns school construction and the relationship to real estate development. You see this first slide that says index MCPS enrollment and total population. The top line, which starts up at about 120 in 1968, represents the MCPS enrollment. The bottom line, which starts down there in 1968 at about 60 on an index basis, shows the total population. So what you see is that during the late 60s, early 70s, into the early 80s, the school-age population of MCPS enrollment was declining, even though the overall population was increasing. That relationship flipped in the early 80s, and since then we've had a long period where the school-age population and MCPS enrollment was increasing faster than the overall population. So you might ask, how is that possible? How can there be such a loose relationship between the number of people who live in Montgomery County and MCPS enrollment? And the answer is that there are demographic waves. The most well known is baby boom and the echo boom, but there are long cycles where the age cohort that is represented by school-age children becomes larger or smaller relative to the overall population. Eventually, we can expect that this relationship will reverse again, and you can expect to see fewer children per capita in the population and relative decline in MCPS enrollment, even though overall enrollment will probably continue going up. But this highlights one of the issues that really challenges MCPS, that there's a lot of school enrollment growth that's not driven by new development, but is driven by demographic factors that are independent of how much housing gets constructed. And the next slide shows projected MCPS enrollment through 2024. Some demographic forecasts show that the population flattens or maybe even declines beyond that, and it's really very difficult to predict when that would happen. But the point is that we have a lot of school overcrowding problems, particularly at the individual neighborhood level, that are not driven by new construction or necessarily an increase in the net number of people who move in. I live in Woodside, just on the edge of downtown Silver Spring. When my son's 18 now, graduated from high school. When he went to kindergarten, when he was 5 years old, there were 2 kids at the bus stop. My daughter is only 4 years younger than he is. By the time she got to kindergarten, there were 6 or 7 kids at the bus stop. And I think we've all seen examples of this in various neighborhoods where the neighborhood turns over and you see younger families moving in, older families are downsizing or moving on for whatever reason. And so you get a lot of bumpiness in the school population, particularly at the neighborhood level. And this is really, I think, a major reason why we have issues with being able to predict school capacity at the individual school cluster or individual elementary school level. The next slide describes some of the factors that affect school enrollment. I've talked about a couple of these, but I'd also mention the move to full-day kindergarten and a long-term trend that began in about 2000 that it appears that there's more a relatively large proportion of families moving to public school from private school than the other way around. The next slide is addressed the topic that I know some of you have heard about, which is generation rates. Many people believe that the assumptions about how many kids live in multifamily houses or apartment buildings are systematically underestimated. So a few years ago, in response to those criticisms, our staff got together with MCPS staff and associated every single student in the school system with a building type. So we were able to isolate over 99% of the students in MCPS, anonymized of course, to a residential address and figured out how many kids live in single family housing, townhouses, mid-rise or low-rise multifamily, high-rise multifamily, and produced these generation rates that you see here in front of you. I'll tell you that they're not actually that much different than the forecasting had shown before, but they are more finely calibrated now, and they're about as rigorous and comprehensive because they rely on the complete data set of all the children in the school system. And what you see there is, that right-hand column, you see the overall relationship between these different types of buildings. It turns out that multifamily high-rise buildings have less than a third the number of students per unit as single-family detached houses. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about that chart if it's interesting. The next slide shows impact taxes. These impact taxes are calculated based on that generation rate of how many kids are there per unit of various types of housing, and combined with the MCPS's actual capital cost of creating new seats associated with having to park a student classroom. And so what that shows is that the single family rate is about is a little over 3 times as much as the multifamily high-rise rate, which is consistent with that generation rate I just showed you. But I just want to give you some perspective on what those charges are and what they're based on. The next slide shows impact tax comparisons by jurisdiction for schools. So you see, I picked out a variety of jurisdictions around the region. I could have selected others. I didn't cherry pick this. This is, I think, a pretty good representation of what the school impact tax range is. And what you see is we have probably the second highest school impact taxes of any jurisdiction in the DC region, including Northern Virginia, and not just the suburbs of DC and Maryland, but some of the other jurisdictions. You'll notice Arlington County doesn't have a bar because they don't charge impact taxes. There are a great many jurisdictions that have no school impact taxes. And until really about a little less than 20 years ago, Montgomery County also relied on property tax on schools. There's no right or wrong answer as to what the best way is to fund schools, but what I'm getting at is there's nothing that says we have to fund schools out of impact taxes versus property taxes or some other source of revenue. And so when people ask the question, well, should we be charging developers more for school construction? My answer is, we have to have some basis on which we're calculating impact tax rates. We already have the second highest rate in the region, or really anywhere nearby, which has obvious implications for things like housing affordability. But if somebody has a better way to calculate this, if they can round in the cost of providing seats for students that are generated by new development, we're certainly open to that. But everybody should understand that we derive these rates from a very rigorous and strenuous effort to try to come up with a well-justified basis for our impact tax rate. The last slide I want to show you, enrollment growth and new development. There are 6 school clusters in Montgomery County that are about to go into moratorium. 3 of those are the school clusters right in the downtown consortium, right around the residential neighborhoods right around downtown Silver Spring, Prince Orchard, WJ, and I'm going to forget one, of course. But this analysis shows that there have been 4,100 additional students in those 6 clusters just in the period from 2011 to 2015. But only 130 of those are from new construction. In the case of Prince Orchard, there's basically been no new development in that period, and yet there's been sharp enrollment increases. So this comes back to the point I was making earlier about how demographic turnover is responsible for a huge proportion of the growth in school enrollment, and new development is, in many cases, a very, very small proportion of that new enrollment growth. So I promised the chair that I would be quick, so I'll wrap it up there, but happy to take your questions or talk to any of you offline if you're interested in that.
Sure. Thank you, Casey. Chairman Barwick?
Casey, this is always my favorite presentation of the year.
Mine too.
And so thank you. So I have a request and a question. The request is I was hoping you could email a PDF of this to me, or to, well, you have my email address. If you don't, I'll get it to you, because I'd really like to share this with my committee, because this is very relevant to what we do. The question I have is kind of a broader question, and it is it safe to say, as a general proposition, that the supply of affordable and mid-range housing, it really seriously lags the demand, or lags the demand for that kind of housing?
I think it's fair to say that housing supply lags at every point in the market. I know that there's a perception that there's a lot of luxury high-rise being built that's empty. That's not true. There is a lot of luxury product being built because there's a market for it. Vacancy rates in Bethesda, Silver Spring, for the newer buildings as well as the older buildings are very low. In fact, I think absorption has really exceeded even expectations of people who are in the real estate business. So I think there's shortage at every point, and we've documented this. We did a rental housing study a couple of years ago that shows that both at the low end of the market and the high end of the market, there's a big shortage. The middle part of the market, at about 80 or 100% of AMI, is actually less underserved than the high and low ends, which I know is also not as sort of contrary to what most people think. But the short answer is we need to produce more housing for everyone.
Okay. And last question, remind me, what is the MPDU percentage for rental housing, multi-housing units, and how often are exceptions made?
The law until recently was 12.5% for everything, everywhere. If you build more than 10 units of housing at a time, anywhere in the county of any kind, whether it's single-family townhouses, high-rise multifamily, whatever, you've got to do at least 12.5% regulated affordable units. Recently, in County Council last year, we worked with them on a bill that raises that percentage to 15% in many parts of the county. So that means 15% in those areas without exception, 12.5% is the bare minimum in certain areas which have a little bit less of an affordability issue. As to exceptions, I'm glad you raised this because a lot of people say, oh, developers are always getting waivers. I've been on the planning board for 7 years now. I have never seen a waiver approved. I've seen 2 cases in which there were buyouts that were approved by DHCA that they recommended that we approve them. Those involved situations. One of them was the quarry project off of River Road, which is an extremely expensive condominium project where the condo fees are more than my mortgage. So we, DHC recommended and we've approved a buyout so those affordable units could be acquired in some other part of the county, because the recognition was it's not realistic to expect somebody of moderate income to pay a low price for their condo, but then get hit with a $3,000 a month condo fee. So, with the exception of those extreme cases, where there's been a couple that are just so off the charts on the condo fee that it really wouldn't be viable for people to be able to live there, these requirements are imposed without exception. And that's administered by DHCA, and we generally defer to their judgment, but they're not cutting people a break or letting them buy out, except in those very few cases.
Thank you.
Delegation?
Thank you. This is always great to see you. I have actually a couple of questions. NPDU, even though it's one of the most successful programs in the Montgomery County has had, that is only speaking to the mid-range. It does not speak to low-income housing. What are we doing to ease low-income housing? And also, another question related to the higher end. There are a lot of concerns among many people I know that we need to build in the high end, and you sort of address that. But what is your case, if you could explain to the delegation why we continue to allow high end multifamily?
Well, if somebody wants to buy a multi-million-dollar condominium at the Lauren, if you want to pay $5 million to live at the Lauren in downtown Bethesda, I say welcome, because you're going to be paying property taxes on that unit, which are going to be, and half of every dollar in property taxes you pay are going to go straight to the school system. So I think that there is a huge benefit to the tax base to people who can afford that kind of housing, and they're paying more than their share for things like school. Yeah, well, they may have kids, they may not have kids, but they're paying their taxes. That doesn't mean that we should allow that to operate to the detriment of housing that's more affordable, and I don't think that it does. So I think the short answer is we should be serving every part of the market, and certainly the issue you raise is a very important one, that the MPU program will only get you to 68% of AMI. There is some benefit to the MPU program for lower income housing, though, because what DHCA will sometimes do is buy down that MPU rate even further. So the county can step in, acquire some of those moderately priced units, and add a rent subsidy to get it down to 30, 40, 50% of AMI. And because it's an MPU, the amount of subsidy that's required to get to those levels is less than if you had to buy the unit at the full market rate. There's other steps we can take, like accessory dwelling units and some of the other, this missing middle idea that I was just alluding to. But really, I think the short answer is that affordable housing isn't all of the above proposition. We need more market rate housing. We need more regulated affordable housing. We need more rent subsidies. All those things have to operate together to meet everybody's needs.
Well, it appears, however, we're going to make this the last question because we have a very full agenda.
Okay. I won't ask more than 7 questions, and they all will be fairly long.
Ready some time. Okay, thank you.
It's always good to see you. Can you talk a little bit about development in the upper part of the county? The reason I ask is because there's a great deal of pressure in the upcounty development, a lot of development going on in the upcounty. But there isn't a lot of infrastructure when it comes to transportation to accommodate that. So a lot of my constituents are very frustrated, extremely frustrated. And the only thing we can really talk about is development that's going on in the Clarksburg area and the lack of county or some degree state infrastructure to support said development. And so I'll kind of leave it open there. That'll be my only question. For you to kind of address that, we can talk more about it offline, but it's increasingly becoming a massive problem.
Well, because we don't have a lot of time, I'll just throw out one idea. I think it would be a mistake to wait until development in the life sciences area around Gaithersburg West, the Great Science Corridor, is sufficient to justify the Corridor City's transit way all the way to Clarksburg. I think we should be looking at a bus rapid transit route up and down the upper 335 corridor that can get to Clarksburg, certainly in our lifetimes, preferably in the next few years. And I think it's really unfortunate that the Hogan administration is trying to move forward with this 270-495 project without a transit component. That seems like that would have been the obvious opportunity. But I hope that we would have support from you as well as people in county government to try to focus on a 355 BRT service in the near term.
Yeah. It's a bit frustrating for a lot of folks up there that there's so much development and the infrastructure is always kind of thought of after the development. And I feel like the county bears a significant responsibility for this as well. I'm going to leave it at that and we can talk offline about it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again. We're going to go to the bill hearing on MC/PG 112-19. We'll bring up Chairman Delegate Barnes and Adrian Gardner, and while they're coming up, Chairman Barber has an announcement.
Yes, fellow colleagues, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of a member of the class of 1990, a guy who got elected the same year as me, Rich LeVay. He's sitting back there. Rich, wave your hand. We were part of the illustrious gang that included Chris Van Hollen and John Hurston, and he is my favorite rapacious capitalist and a good example of a guy who was fiscally conservative but very socially liberal. He supported choice and he supported gay rights at the time when not a lot of Republicans did. So, Rich, welcome back. Great to see you.
Delegate Barnes, next to your
Chairman, Vice Chair, Delegation. For the record, my name is Delegate Darrell Barnes from Princeton, Georgia, Stafford, Maryland. I'm here to speak on House Bill 1279. You all have the bill before you. Basically, the bill authorizes the Maryland National Park Planning Commission to reestablish a minority business enterprise MBE procurement program that is consistent with the state. 2, the authorizes small business enterprise program for vendors headquartered within the Bi-County region. And 3, charges appropriate state agencies to provide data and technical support. And with that, I ask for a favorable vote. And if you have any questions, we're here to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Gardner.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the delegation. For the record, Adrian Gardner. It is my privilege to serve as the General Counsel for the Park and Planning Commission. The Commission fully supports the bill and thanks Delegate Barnes for this effort. We think that this is another tool in our toolkit that we need in order to reverse the trend that I think that we've handed out some data to the delegation. I'll be happy to answer questions, but I'll keep my testimony brief.
Thank you. Any questions? Great. That concludes the bill hearing on MC/PG 112-19. We'll now move on to MC/PG 113-19. I don't believe there's any proponent of the bill here. Is that correct? We do have someone signed up in opposition, Karen Riley from WSSC. Keep in mind as you testify that no one testified in support of the legislation. Please go ahead.
I'll keep that in mind. Good morning. My name is Karen Riley for the record. I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for WSSC. You all have our written testimony. The bottom line of this legislation is that WSSC already has 14 high bill adjustments, so we have a variety of high bill adjustments, including one that addresses on-property and in-home leaks. That's much actually better than the one that's proposed in the bill. We actually give you water and sewer credit. We reduced the amount of time last year we took action to reduce the amount of time between credits for high bills from one every 7 years to now once every 3 years for interior leaks, on-property leaks. There's no time frame. You can have a break today and have one tomorrow. We'll give you credit for excess water and sewer bills. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Delegate Carr.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question has to do with the policy of WSSC for if there's an unusual circumstance and a customer has a leak, something's wrong with their water hose or something in the house. My understanding is that WSSC will give a one-time credit if the bill is like 3 times higher than a previous bill. Is that current policy discriminatory? Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a home with just one person living in the home. I have a leak of 10,000 gallons during my billing period, it gets corrected. WSSC gives me a credit because my bill is 3 times more what the previous bill was. A different property has 5 people living in a home. They have an identical leak, identical amount of gallons of water, but they don't get that credit because even though the same amount of water was lost and that customer was harmed financially, the customer discriminated against just because it wasn't 3 times their bill, maybe it was 2 times, but the exact same amount of water is lost. Is there a discriminatory aspect to WSSC's current leakage credit policy?
Elliot, I think you're referring to something that was addressed, I guess, in terms of classes, whether it's a larger household versus a small household. Is that the question?
No, I'm specifically asking about when a customer has a leak and asks for credit because of a special circumstance. Isn't the current policy rather discriminatory?
I think we have to have baselines for every policy. We can't just randomly give credits for when there are high bills that may be a little bit over what is normally paid. If we were to do that, you all would see us coming back and making sure that the county council increase the rate substantially, because we're not trying to socialize all of the costs for on-property issues. I would not say that's discriminatory. If you have a bill 3 times your average and it's an unusual, we can't figure out what it is. And remember, that's just only one of the 14 adjustments. If you just have no clue why your bill is that high, we'll look at other adjustments, but it doesn't discriminate against. If your average usage for a 5-person household is large anyway, and you lose the same amount of water, you may not reach that 3 times threshold because your prior bill was already large. So as opposed to a 1-person household or a 2-person household, one of the smaller households, your bill is going to be larger if you lose that much money because it's not in line with the amount of usage that you would have normally. So it's not discriminatory. It just falls within our baseline in our range.
Any other questions? Great, that concludes the bill hearing on MC/PG 113-19. We'll now move to MC/PG 115/19. Tiffany Harvey on behalf of Prince George's County and Adrian Gardner on behalf of Clark County. Harvey, thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the delegation, Vice Chair. My name is Tiffany Harvey. I am Legislative Director for County Executive Office of Prince George's County. Thank you for having us this morning. I'm seated next to Adrian Gardner from our Planning. I will be very brief on this bill. This bill is a high priority area for the County Executive also. It's important to her that we establish federal lines of youth sports opportunities and recreation for kids in Prince George's County. This bill only impacts Prince George's County and it charges the Prince George's County Planning Board to expressly create a youth sports division as a part of the county's recreation program. I will be brief unless there are questions.
Gardner?
Good morning again, Mr. Chairman. I will make 3 points very briefly. One is that the Commission, the Prince George's Planning Board supports this legislation because it creates a new emphasis, a new policy direction for the department based on data that's consistent with our research in the community. Second, I want to make it clear and confirm that any funding that's necessary to support this program, it will be allocated strictly and paid strictly in Prince George's County. And 3 is that it would not impact the operations of the commission in Montgomery County. I'll be happy to answer any other questions, but we think it's a good piece of legislation.
Thank you. Any questions? Great. That concludes the bill hearing on MC/PG 115-19. We'll now move to MC/PG 116-19. We'll bring up Delegate Carr and also Carol Rubin from Park and Planning, I believe, is here. If you want to join in. And just a reminder for this bill, the sponsor has as much time as he shall consume, and then those representing an organization have 3 minutes. Individuals have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, colleagues. Is this mic working?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So, for the record, Al Carr, we represent MCPG 116-19. This bill has to do with mandatory referrals, and mandatory referrals are in the current law. So, developers when they build something, are subject to zoning and regulation and oversight by park and planning and by the county councils. When governments build things, they aren't subject to zoning, but there is a form of review called mandatory referral. So if I'm state highway and I want to build a new salt barn in District 18, I have to submit that to the planning board for review and for the opportunity for public comment. And it's an advisory process. Park and planning can't stop a project from happening, but they can have some review and oversight. So this bill is designed to plug some loopholes in that process by which an agency like State Highway might be able to widen the beltway without the appropriate level of review. There is an amendment in the packet that limits the scope of the bill just to the aspect of having a complete submittal. When an agency submits something to the planning board, that submittal needs to be complete. They can't just write something on a cocktail napkin and say, here's our submittal, and get into an argument about whether it's complete. 60 days elapses and they get to go forward without the review and that public scrutiny. So I'll ask for your favorable report and I'll hand this over to Carol Rubin.
Morning. I want to thank Delegates Carr, Corman, Shelby, and Solomon for introducing and sponsoring this bill. And I'm here on behalf of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission to recommend the delegation's favorable report of this legislation, which clarifies the requirement for a complete submission before the review clock starts ticking. We're asking that the current law, we're not asking that the current law be changed, but just that the established procedures be clarified. So among its responsibilities, Park and Planning provides regulatory review of development projects throughout Montgomery County and Prince George's County to assure consistency with adopted master plans and compliance with local subdivision, zoning, and environmental laws and regulations. The Commission's hearings are held in open session, affording the public an opportunity to present their support for or to raise any concerns they may have with regard to the potential impact of a proposed development on their communities. Mandatory referral is the process under which the public boards, bodies, and officials must submit certain planned activities and public projects to the Commission for review and advisory guidance concerning the proposed location, character, grade, and extent of activity of the project or the activity before its implementation. And the Commission supports the bill because mandatory referral process ordinarily is the only opportunity for public discourse, analysis, and comment by the community on development projects undertaken by state and local government agencies, and certain aspects of the mandatory referral needs clarification. Any fair disclosure process requires divulging information adequate for residents to fully understand the nature of the public project, specifically how the proposed location, character, grade, and extent of the activity will affect them and their community. Even though the process results in the recommendations that are non-binding, it provides an opportunity to the public to address their concerns in an open public forum. Because so many of the public projects are under a tight schedule and budget, review under mandatory referral is required within 60 days of the submission by the public body. In fact, if the Commission does not hold a hearing within that 60-day period, the application is deemed approved without comment. As amended, this bill establishes, HB 859 establishes that the 60-day period for the mandatory referral is not triggered until a complete submittal is accepted for review. This legislation assures that all the necessary information from the public body is included in each submission before the Commission is required to review and present to the public. A complete submission will assure the Commission's comments are thorough, comprehensive, and appropriately address all issues. A complete submission will assure that that information is necessary for the residents to fully understand the nature of the activity proposed. Through the Commission's e-plan system, The mandatory referral applications are completed online. The application is accepted as complete, or a list of incomplete items is provided to the applicant. What this legislation does is it just codifies that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for the sponsor, Ms. Rubin? Okay, thank you. We will move on to the opponents. Susan Swift of the Suburban Maryland Transportation Alliance and Emmett Tidings. Tidings?
Today.
Yep.
Thank you for having me, Jerry Corman and members of the delegation. My name is Susan Swift. I'm the executive director of the Suburban Maryland Transportation Alliance. We're a nonprofit advocating for transportation. SMTA opposes this bill because these sections of the statute really need a complete overhaul. The two amendments make an unclear and murky statute even more murky. For those of you who know me, I was a former director of the planning department for the city of Rockville, and I've dealt with this part of the statute many, many times over the last 10 years, and it needs to be rewritten in full, not these two tweaks that will make it worse. First of all, the statute does not even state the purpose of this review. If it required those facilities that are not already part of a master plan or a functional plan to be reviewed, that would prevent the mandatory referral process from undermining a master plan. So the statute doesn't talk about what its purpose is. Second, it's not applied to all situations listed in the law, and if it was, it would be very redundant because many of these projects are already in master plans and don't need multiple reviews. For example, the one addition on a complete submission, the parking planning's guidelines for mandatory referrals on page 2 specifically says it has to have a complete submission. So they already have the power to enforce that. I'm sure politics make it more difficult to enforce that, having been in their role, but that section is in the bill is unneeded. There are a lot of other sections that need to be added to fix it. The section B, which requires separate reviews, this is the most worrisome from SMTA's perspective. The word action, it says the action subject may require separate reviews, but it never says what an action is. It never defines it. So is the action each geographic segment of, for example, MDOT's proposals for the interstates? Is it going to be a holistic review of phase 1 or phase 2 along the highways? Or is it going to be at acquisition, which is what the verbs that they have in the bill? Is it going to be one review at acquisition, one review at the preferred alternative, one review at construction, one review at et cetera, et cetera? I see 4 actions if you look at the verbs in the existing bill. So I think that this statute needs to be fixed for these sections, but not this way. And just one last comment, just to remind you that the county's priority letter for MDOT in 2017 and many prior letters all request specifically high occupancy toll lanes for I-270 corridor and a portion of I-495. So we don't want to lengthen those who are waiting for these projects with additional process that's already covered in parking planning's guidelines. Thank you very much.
Any questions from Ms. Swift? Great, thank you. That concludes the bill hearing on MC/PU 116-19. We will now go to the chair of the Metro Washington Committee for a little housekeeping on the bill.
Okay. So for MCPG 104-19, it was amended in the Prince George's delegation. The amendment just makes a correction. There was an outdated reference to the executive director. The actual term is general manager for WSSC. So it's before us for a vote to just concur with the amendments that were made in the Prince George's.
Second.
Any discussion? Great. All in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great. I assume all our votes will be that easy from here on. Let's move on to our voting sessions. We're going to jump to Economic Development Committee first. Chair Kelly.
Okay, how's it going? Hang on 1 second. Multitasking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have one bill that came out of the Economic Development Committee. You all may remember it had a slightly interesting hearing, the Just Cause Eviction Bill. It came out of the subcommittee 5-1. And I think all of the amendments were supported unanimously. We did put on a significant number of amendments, so you may want to refer to the documents in your packet. They're sort of bullet pointed in the back. You should also have an interlineated version of the bill in your folder. So just starting at the beginning, I will say that this is not one of the bills where we found peace in the valley and the compromise everyone was happy with. It is still not supported by AOBA. It is supported by the Council and the Executive, for the Metro Alliance, and the Commission on Aging, which was, I think, a really interesting letter of support. But again, you know, not supported by AOBA. There was no compromise found in the amendments we put in. That being said, I'll tell you what the amendments do. You can read the bullet points as easily as I can, but they're really, you know, clarifying that the bill only applies to holdover tenants. We added an age reason for just cause in case the tenant was habitually late in paying rent that came from the county. We added an exception for when just cause is needed for cases in which the lease is owner-occupied building with one unit for obvious reasons. And also in cases where the lease was part of the employment by the landlord. So if you imagine you had a super who was fired for some reason, they would still get 60 days notice. They wouldn't be kicked out, but it would make sense that they would no longer have the lease there. And that was also suggested by the county. We clarified the method by which just cause must be made to tenants, so must be sent in writing. You can read that on the front of your sheet. 60 days notice by first class mail, certified with a certificate in writing, stating the just cause upon which the eviction is based. That's really, I mean, that's about it. So it was a lot of amendments, but all the amendments did was really clarify how the bill would work, make sure that this was, we were talking about only the holdover section of the law. With that, we were really just making a policy decision on whether we supported the bill or we didn't. The vote came out 5-1. But, you know, I'm looking in front of the delegation and I know that there were people who had really strong opinions, you know, not in support of the underlying premise of this bill in the hearing. There's nothing that changed with the amendments that would change those concerns, I think. I will speak for myself before I heard the amendments, which is, I stewed on this a lot because I think people made really good points in the hearing on both sides of the bill. And I think for me, it was just a moral judgment call. Good people can disagree on this bill, but for me, I could just hear my mother's voice. You know, I don't talk about this a lot, but I grew up really poor, and my mother had a job processing eviction notices, and she said she never felt worse about any job she ever had. She would have rather been a prostitute than do that work, because poor people know what it's like to be really vulnerable. So I think that this bill goes a little way in making poor people a little less vulnerable, and otherwise vulnerable people a little less vulnerable. Doesn't solve all of the world's problem, but I think it makes a big difference. And with that, I move the amendments.
Second. All right, discussion on the amendments. Can we adopt the committee amendments? All in favor of the committee amendments, signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposition to the committee amendments?
And just before, I know that Delegate Crutchfield has an additional amendment she wanted to discuss.
Other amendments? Delegate Crutchfield?
Sure. And what my amendment does is it actually excludes the smaller landlords who actually own fewer than 4 rental units. So that's all it does, is it excludes those smaller landlords from this.
Chair of the committee, is this a friendly amendment?
I don't think it is considered a friendly amendment. The committee actually discussed this a little bit. We thought we were going to have the amendment introduced in subcommittee. So we did not discuss it publicly in subcommittee, but the idea was percolated and floated through some folks who I know expressed concern that that may exclude too many people from the bill. And my understanding is the sponsor also has some thoughts on why the amendment might be a little overly broad.
Okay, you know, I messed up. We need a second on the amendment. I think I messed up. Okay, so on the amendment.
On this one. Yes, I really appreciate the delegate for talking with me, about this amendment. I am concerned about this amendment because I think one of the things we want to prevent is a haves and have-nots in our evictions process. When people go to court, oh, you live in this type of unit and your landlord has court arrest and you don't get just cause, or you do, so you do live in a one, with a landlord who has a good building, so you get just cause. So I just think we need to be careful about creating some kind of have or have nots, process when it comes to our just cause laws. Also, when we review jurisdictions that have just cause, there was not a trend where these types of units were exempted. As you remember, there are many jurisdictions across the country that have just cause. It's not something that we saw. So I do have pause around this amendment, and I will not be voting in support of it.
Anyone else on the amendment? Delegate Shetty.
Question for Delegate Crutchfield. Do you have any information about the number of tenants or percentage of tenants that would be impacted by this amendment?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Anyone else on the amendment? Only then we'll do a roll call from the top.
Delegate Isabel?
No. Are you in favor of the amendment?
No. Delegate Barber?
No.
Delegate Carr?
No.
Delegate Charkoudian?
No.
Delegate Crutchfield?
Yes.
Delegate Collison?
No.
Delegate Dume?
Yes.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo?
No.
Delegate Gilchrist?
No.
Delegate Kaiser?
Yes.
Delegate Kelly?
No.
Delegate Lopez?
Yes.
Delegate Love?
No.
Delegate Lutke?
Yes.
Delegate Moon?
No.
Delegate Palakovich Carr?
No.
Delegate Chi?
Yes.
Delegate Queen?
No.
Delegate Resnick?
No.
Delegate Shetty?
No.
Delegate Solomon?
No.
Delegate Stewart?
No.
Delegate Wilkins?
No.
Mr. Chairman?
No. Okay, our motion on the bill.
I have a question.
Delegate May.
So one of the amendments indicates that this applies only to Montgomery County and requires the clerk of the circuit court of Montgomery County, to the extent practicable, whatever that means, on or before June 1st of each year, to make publicly available on the circuit court website and report to the Montgomery County Executive Council and state government a long list of things. Landlord-tenant actions are in the district court. Was this discussed at all with the court? I mean, number one, the circuit court and district court in Montgomery County will now, in I think 6 months, need to go through this whole process of MDEC, which is the electronic filing. Normally, something like this would require a whole other person to do this, and the court just isn't going to be able to comply. Obviously, if there was a fiscal note to the bill, we would have that information, but it's too early for fiscal notes. I think this amendment's really problematic, and particularly if nobody ever talked to the administrative office of the courts about it. The clerk in the circuit court doesn't do this. The administrative office of the courts might, but not only that, again, it's not even in the right court.
Mr.
Delegate
Chair.
Kaiser.
I serve on the subcommittee, and we were under the understanding that they were the appropriate court. The rationale behind this amendment from Delegate Lopez, as I understand it, is to gather as much data as possible, that we knew that it only told part of the story and not all of the story of these just cause or certain situations. And so, that was the intent. If we need to change the language of which court, I think that that's something we should be able to simply do.
I also don't think it's the court. I mean, the court doesn't keep these kinds of staff. And you're asking the court to literally have to go through and do it by hand. Maybe once MDEC is in place, there are going to be a lot more reports that the court can do. But that was the reason for my objection to the amendments, and I just wanted everyone to be aware of that.
Delegate Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm part of the subcommittee, and I raised a similar concern that Delegate Crutchfield actually raised. So my separate point is, I feel like we are rushing to pass the bill. We are shooting in the dark, trying to legislate what we don't know much about or enough of. And this has remained my concern. Housing is a very complex market. There are multiple tiers, as you just heard this morning. There were over 10,000 eviction notices issued in 2017. Why haven't we gathered the data to really understand the fiscal notes and the impact on the most vulnerable people before we go through a legislation like this? 800-some people ended up being evicted. Even though the rest of 9,000-some people were not evicted, why didn't we look into the reasons landlords issued those eviction notices, even though they did not want to say, but there were real reasons, right? So what was their reason? Was that discrimination, retaliation, whatever? We need to figure it out before we legislate. I just think it's not prudent to reach such a conclusion. This is dangerous. It's a local bill that only applies to Montgomery County. We are yet again reinforcing a very dangerous image, which is we overregulate Montgomery County businesses and we only put owners on the landlords. We need to be very careful about these local bills.
Before we continue, is there a motion on the bill?
Not yet.
Mr. Chairman.
Second. Yeah, I just did.
Great.
Oh, second.
Discussion on the bill, Delegate Wilkins.
I would just like to remind my colleagues, especially on the comment about this being rushed. We have been studying this bill and this issue for over a year. There have been no less than 12 open public meetings that all of us have participated in, whether at the county, whether they were in Rockville public meetings that I held around the interim study in Silver Spring, the county council discussing it. There have been at least 12 meetings and discussions. And any substantive changes that anyone, for the most part, has wanted to provide, we have considered them and made those amendments. So I think that it's really important that we get back to the core of this bill, which is the fact that there are people in our communities that are being evicted with absolutely no reason provided. Their belongings put out in the public right of way, and there's no place in the process that asks the question, why are we putting this person out of their home? So that's the only comment that I wanted to make, that this has been a thoroughly discussed and evaluated piece of legislation, and there have been so many opportunities for anyone to be able to engage and provide their input and feedback. Thank you.
Delegate Lupke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I'm a supporter of the bill. It didn't end up exactly where I wanted it, which is why I voted for Delegate Crutchfield's amendment. But I do think that Delegate Dumais raises a point that merits further consideration, which is that, we do need more data on this. It's important that we get that language right. It's a basic drafting issue that I think could be dealt with relatively simply, discussing with the courts, figuring out who's the appropriate venue. And I don't think another week does that much harm. So I would move to special order for another week so that the subcommittee has time to consider that and figure out the details of it.
Okay. Is there a second on the special order?
Second.
Sounds like there might be discussion on the special order. Chair Kelly?
I believe, and I'm not sure what the timing is with the bill hearing, but I think the sponsor wants, if possible, for us to move forward, and maybe we could consider
It's March 21st. Mr. Chairman,
Delegate Farley.
it's March 21st, right?
Okay.
Yeah. February 21st.
March 21st, I wouldn't need that.
It's February 22nd.
Delegate Kaiser.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and for reading Chair Kelly's mind in this, that if we take this special order to look at the data piece to ensure that members of the delegation share any other concerns they have, so we're not in the same place next week, special ordering because of another piece of the bill. That would be great.
Delegate Lopez.
So I need to keep on with topics here, but go back to the...
Sorry, this is on the special order. That's what we're debating right now.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the special order to talk about data, my intention with the amendment really comes from a general frustration that I found as a first-time lawmaker just trying to get data on
This is
Delegate Lopez, this is on the waiting a week on the bill.
Gotcha. Yeah. So
I put forward probably my best effort to figure out the details of what would be necessary for, to get the most out of the bill. And perhaps it was inartfully crafted, not knowing what would be the authority to hold that data or monitor it. So, if it's helpful to take another week, I can do some digging and come up with some answers that will satisfy the members of the committee.
Great. Anyone else on the special order? Great. All in favor of the special order, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Special order carries. That was supposed to be the easier one. Voting session. Land Use, Transportation, and Public Safety Committee. Delegate Wilkins.
So the Land Use, Transportation, and Public Safety Committee discussed MC 2719 for a few weeks. In the end, we ended up doing a drastic amendment to the bill. So as amended, the bill requires a golf course or country club that's located on land that has an average market value of at least $500,000 per acre to pay the county an annual fee of $100,000. And then the county is required to deposit the fee into its general fund. So basically, as amended, it basically goes from a per acre to just a standard $100,000 fee for a country club that has a market value of $500,000. So that is where the bill currently stands now. That's the amendment. I'd like to move the amendment.
Is there a second on the amendment? Discussion on the committee amendment. Yes, that would be nice.
So I understand under this, under the amendment, that there's one thing that's been stricken as a constitutional amendment. Is it, was it a constitutional amendment because it was a tax?
Yes.
And my understanding is that a fee is generally for some service that is provided, or is a fee to support a regulatory scheme. In my humble opinion, this fee is neither. It is a tax. And I don't think we can get away with just calling it a fee.
So, Delegate Dume, I certainly appreciate the comment. There is an Attorney General opinion, I understand, that has been developed. However, because this is a fee that is being assessed to these properties, the way that the amendment was drafted is that it would not require, the council has advised that it would not require that constitutional amendment. Delegate Stewart worked really hard in developing and crafting this amendment, so if you'd like to add to that, but I certainly understand the question and concern, but because it's a fee, you do understand it.
But we're calling it a fee.
Sure.
Delegate Stewart?
Just very briefly, yeah, I did a lot of research into exactly what the precedent for this would be, because a lot of members of the delegation came up to me and said, I think this is silly for this to have to be a constitutional amendment. It goes on the ballot in 2020. And so basically the precedent for this is something called a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes. And we have almost 700 of them that have already been established in Maryland. I think the number is actually 687. There are several in Baltimore City, I think more than 200 in Baltimore City. They generally relate to nonprofits, to clubs, to hospitals, to even churches, to institutions including St. John's College that would otherwise be exempt from either the bulk of or all property taxes. They then pay a fee. The idea is that they, for whatever reason, cannot afford the entire payment of the property tax, but the local government or the state government has come to an agreement with them where they can help out with the public offers in a way that they can afford. None of those 687 pilots have ever been on the ballot or have ever been challenged. And so I think we're on very firm legal grounding that this does not have to be a constitutional amendment.
Delegate Barbeck?
Oh, no, I'll speak on the bill.
Delegate Kaiser on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Piggybacking on what Delegate Dume said in terms of this fee versus tax, generally when we apply fees, those fees cover a cost of something. A driver's license fee covers the cost of regulating and managing it. The fishing license that people pay for covers the regulating and watching over. What is this fee covering? Anything?
Chair of the committee.
Question for anybody.
Chair of the committee. Delegate Stewart?
So I would not call it a fee. I mean, colloquially, I call it a fee. Legally, it's a pilot. It's a payment in lieu of taxes. Generally, those just go to the general funds of the local or the state government. They're usually not earmarked for something. However, I am aware of an amendment on the floor that we'll probably vote after this amendment that would allot this payment, fee, call it whatever you want, to a specific purpose. I think it's a good amendment, but we can discuss that.
I just want to say that it's not about directing when we get lottery money and say we're going to spend it here or there. Is that a fee is supposed to cover the actual function. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I'm asking in that sense which function, but you're still saying it's not a fee, but it's.
Delegate Moon, on the amendments.
On the amendment, I would just point out to everyone that we all voted for a pilot early in session. It was the Speaker's bill, and it was designed to compensate the city of Annapolis for the fact that the State House grounds, which otherwise are not tax generating. But anyway, so let me finish.
You can finish.
Okay.
I'm just lining up.
So there was a second bill that was running alongside this one. It had to do with environmental issues. And so, look, I think Delegate Stewart has it right that the compensation contemplated by this pilot is a loss of substantial revenue from the county from having a non-tax revenue generating entity occupying land, and that scheme was a creation of Montgomery County lawmakers in this delegation did many years ago. And so, is this the ideal way to do this? No. The ideal way to do this is to assess the properties at a fair rate and just have everyone pay in. But people didn't want to do that. They didn't want to do it as a statewide bill. They didn't want to do it as a local bill that had to go on the ballot. And so through the process of compromise, we're here with a pilot. But the concept of a nonprofit, a hospital, a college, or some other entity sitting on land that deprives a municipality of tax revenue and therefore leads to a negotiated pilot is entirely not new. Now, whether you agree or disagree with this particular use of the pilot, that seems to be more on the substance of whether you agree or disagree with this bill. If you don't agree with the bill, you're not going to like us putting a pilot on here. And if you agree with the bill, you'll be fine with the pilot. Most of us who agree with the pilot would also be in favor of simply changing the tax rates. So I think we got here through means that we're all familiar with and through the narrowing process required during the discussion 2 years now in a row on this bill. I think this is all about compromise. This is probably as close as we will ever get to whittling this bill down to something that does not harm the small struggling clubs, comes with a price point that's affordable, and unlike the way the bill was originally drafted, the way it was originally drafted, it would require to go on the ballot, and the county wouldn't see any money until the year 2030. But with the amendment, the county starts to see this revenue, I think, by the year 2022. So in the time it would have taken for us to get the revenues, if the bill was passed as introduced, this amendment would cause the county to gain $4 million in revenue. And to put it, what the cost is, Delegate Kaiser, about that this fee is justifying. The last time we touched these rates was in the year 2002, almost 20 years ago. Again, the county's asked us not to do this. The revenue loss to the county in the period since the legislature, directed by Montgomery County lawmakers last did this, $200 million in revenue.
Okay, on the amendment, Delegate Lucas.
I move the previous question.
Second. All in favor of the previous question, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, great. The committee amendments will do a roll call vote from the top.
Delegate Isabel?
Yes.
Delegate Barber?
No.
Delegate Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Charkoudian?
Yes.
Delegate Crutchfield?
No.
Delegate Collison?
Yes.
Delegate Dumaine?
No.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo?
No.
Delegate Gilchrist?
Yes.
Delegate Kaiser?
No.
Delegate Kelly?
No.
Delegate Lopez?
No.
Delegate Love?
No.
Delegate Lutke?
Yes.
Delegate Moon?
Yes.
Delegate Palakovich Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Chief? Delegate Queen?
No.
Delegate Resnick?
No.
Delegate Shetty?
Yes.
Delegate Solomon?
Yes.
Delegate Stewart?
Yes.
Delegate Wilkins?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
The committee amendments carried. Other amendments? Delegate Leakey.
I have an amendment that should have been distributed in your packets. It's 316612/1. What this amendment does, because there's a lot of conversation about the existence of this credit to protect open space, is to take any revenues that comes from pilot and dedicate it 50% to projects that are eligible for program open space, which is mostly neighborhood parks and things like that, and 50% to the county's agricultural land preservation programs. This would further the county's open space goals. It also seems to me that if the delegation is taking the vote that the council will not have to take in order to put this pilot in place, that we should have some say in where the revenue goes. So I move the amendment.
Second.
Discussion on the amendment. Okay, so we'll do a roll call from the top.
Delegate Isabella?
Yes. Top of the ballot, delegate.
That was chair, I was reversed, let's go back. But that was when pterodactyls filled the
Yeah.
sky.
From the top, delegate Esposito.
Delegate Barber?
Yes.
Delegate Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Charkoudian?
Yes.
Delegate Crutchfield?
Yes.
Delegate Collison?
Yes.
Delegate Dume?
No.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo?
Yes.
Delegate Gilchrist?
No.
Delegate Kaiser?
No.
Delegate Kelly?
No.
Delegate Lopez?
Yes.
Delegate Love?
No.
Delegate Lutke?
Yes.
Delegate Moon?
Yes.
Delegate Palakovich Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Chi?
Yes.
Delegate Queen?
No.
Delegate Resnick?
No.
Delegate Shetty?
Yes.
Delegate Solomon?
No.
Delegate Stewart?
Yes.
Delegate Wilkins?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
No. Amendment carries. Congratulations. Other amendments?
What was the vote?
16-9.
Any other amendments? Last call. Any other amendments? Okay. Is there a motion on the bill?
I'm waiting for comment.
Sorry, is there a motion on the bill?
Who is amended?
Is there a second? Great. Discussion on the bill. Delegate Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since that first amendment passed, I can now go back to it, even though we moved beyond it. Thank you. But Delegate Moon's example of what we did for the city of Annapolis, $750,000 of the speaker's bill, as an example to suggest that we passed pilots. Well, that was a pilot. That truly was a payment in lieu of taxes. That because of the state buildings here in the city of Annapolis that don't pay a property tax, whereas these golf courses do pay the property tax. So his example was a case of actually doing a pilot. And again, in my mind, a fee has to cover a real thing, and that's exactly what that Annapolis bill does. I think this bill is ill thought out, and I just don't think it's not good tax policy. There's no basis for it. Thank you.
Delegate Barber.
What an irony. I remember when I first got elected in 1990, I was so happy not to be appointed to the committee that I now chair. And I now know more about open space and because of Ways and Means tax rates than I ever cared to know about. Let me say a few things, because many allegations have been made in the course of this bill. I just want everybody to know that whatever pesticides and fertilizers are used in by either farmers or golf courses, all regulated by the state of Maryland. Whether it's a farm or a golf course, the public doesn't have access to it. You know, farmers get this lower tax rate, a lower tax rate as well, and the public doesn't have access. And I know that's been brought up by many people, but, you know, during the course of being on Ways and Means for 8 years, I got to raise a lot of taxes and help somebody get elected governor as a result. And I have got to close a lot of corporate tax loopholes and implement subsidies. So I know what corporate tax loopholes look like, and I know what subsidies look like, and this isn't either one of those two things. A corporate tax loophole is an instance where a clever tax accountant finds an inappropriate use for a tax provision, a use that wasn't intended by the legislature. You know, this isn't that. This isn't an example of a corporation headquartering in Delaware and then shifting all of its expenses to Maryland so they don't have to pay the Maryland corporate income tax. This tax treatment was done deliberately to help to cover open space, and I'll get to whether or not this is open space in a second. It's also not a subsidy. A subsidy is where the government gives money to somebody to have them do something they wouldn't have otherwise done. For example, we give a subsidy to people to buy electric cars, whether you support it or not. I do support it. That's a subsidy, okay? The purpose of this was to acknowledge the fact that land is not going into development as industrial or commercial or residential. And, you know, farmers get a lower rate, and I think most people agree with that. Is a golf course open space? Well, yeah, it is. The clubhouse is an open space, and if there's a tennis court, that's not open space, and the parking lot is an impervious surface, that's not open space either. And those uses of a country club would not get the open space tax credit. The open space is, let's face it, it's open space. Now, you may not think that it's as nice as a farm, but let me assure you, it's basically the same thing as a farm. You're cultivating open space for profit. Basically, that's what it is. In fact, the water runoff is much lower than a farm because they're not tilling the soil, so there's much less runoff into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. You know, to me, this looks like a luxury tax. That's what this really looks like to me. And here's the problem. Now, I'm a guy who has raised taxes on millionaires not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, sort of rich. I was central in raising the corporate income tax and closing corporate tax loopholes. But if you read the literature, the economic literature about luxury taxes, you will find that there's near unanimity among economists, both conservative and liberal, that they're a terrible mechanism for redistributing wealth. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Rich people have a lot of money, and they are able to direct their discretionary spending pretty much anywhere they want to. And it's very easy for them to do that. So if they are no longer a member of a country club, they'll go on that trip to Bora Bora for 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks, or they'll buy a bigger SUV, or they'll do something else with their luxury discretionary spending. This is a luxury tax, and as a liberal Democrat, I don't agree with luxury taxes because they are ineffective mechanisms. And this one, I think, is particularly bizarre because I heard it said by somebody that, you know, in the age of resistance, we've got to fight back. But the irony is that if the average American voted like the average rich person in Montgomery County, Hillary would be sitting in the White House right now. So, you know, I'm going to vote against this. I don't think it's a subsidy. I don't think it's a loophole. I do think having a lower rate for open space, even if some fertilizer is used, like with farmers, I think that's a reasonable treatment of this property, and so I'm going to vote no.
Thank you, Delegate Acevera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, I'd just like to remind each and every one of us about the reality back in Montgomery County. And that reality is that we're looking at a budget shortfall. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, whether we want to call it a subsidy, whether we want to call it luxury tax, whatever we want to call it, we have currently private country clubs and golf courses that are not assessing their value in the way that should properly be assessed. And it was asked earlier about a fee, what the cost is for that fee. The cost is a social cost. And that cost is that we are not allowing local government to use funds that they would otherwise use in order to provide the kind of critical services that each and every one of us agree that we need in the county. And so what is taking place in this bill, and I had submitted an amendment, but I withdrew that amendment because I believe that we need to ensure that we are funding social services, and the only way we're able to do so is by having a fair system where everyone pays, whether it's their fair share of taxes, whether they're assessing their property the way that it should be assessed. All of that is ensuring that we're providing government with the kind of discretionary funds to provide these essential services that not just us, but our neighbors rely on. And so it is our responsibility as legislators to ensure that we're being judicious, not just with the public dollar, but with the public trust. And this is a part of the public trust. If we are allowing properties, particularly private golf courses, country clubs, to not properly assess their value, that is the social cost. And so I will be in support of this bill because I believe we need to be providing local government with greater resources so that they can provide social services. And at a time when we're seeing budget shortfalls, we should not be allowing properties, open spaces, private country clubs that, quite frankly, the requirements to get into those country clubs are pretty exclusive, high, require recommendations. Whatever it is, in order to get into these country clubs, it is our responsibility to ensure that folks are not just being fairly taxed, but properties are being fairly assessed. And I think it's a matter that, a lot of folks are looking at us, and we need to provide that kind of a leadership. I will be voting in support of this, and I'd just like to remind folks about the realities back home and what it is that we have to deal with. And call it a fee, call it a luxury tax, a subsidy, or what have you, what we're allowing people to do is get away with undervaluing property, which in turn has a social cost. That is the social cost. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will be supporting the bill as amended.
Thank you, Delegate Luther.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The comparison I draw is with Baltimore. 100 years ago, Baltimore was one of the biggest cities in the U.S. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the U.S. You can still see the vestiges of that, and if you go to the Engineers Club or the Walters Gallery, it's not anymore. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that it matured and its economy stagnated and the thinking didn't change fast enough. Luckily, they're in a place now where that's starting to shift. But one of the problems they face is they have by far the highest real property tax rate in the state of Maryland. Montgomery County's rate is like 74 cents per $100. Baltimore City's is $2.50 per $100. And people are paying thousands and thousands of dollars more on their real property tax than we pay in Montgomery County on houses that cost more. And part of the reason that happens is because there are so many nonprofit institutions. As the city matured, nonprofit institutions took over more and more land. And so the city has done its best to fill that hole with the pilots that Delegate Stewart mentioned earlier, almost 200 of them. But it's not enough. And the tax base in the city has been problematic for decades. In Montgomery County, we're entering a new era, right? We've been sucking at the teat of the federal government for a very, very long time. And that's not there anymore, right? And our county is now a mature county. We are going to have long-term revenue challenges, and we need our nonprofit sector to step up in the way that Baltimore City's nonprofit sector has been stepping up. So I see this as a question of making sure the county has the revenue base it needs over the next few decades as we adjust to a new normal. So I'm going to vote in favor.
Thank you, Delegate Queen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So I just want to make a comment about and answer some of the comments that the sponsor of this bill proposed. So there's a lot of legislation that has been done before we got here. And we can not like it, we can change it. And if we no longer think open space is the way we want to go, then we change that impact to all of the country clubs. We don't just pick and choose country clubs by zip codes. Setting policy by zip codes, whether it's the low rent district or the high rent district, is not the way we set public policy. Now, if we're saying to ourselves that we don't want to have certain nonprofits have the benefit, let's change that. I've heard the lead sponsor talk about churches. If that's where we're going next, then let's look at that. But if we're going to do that, let's do it fair and across the board. How is it just 4 country clubs are impacted by this and not all the ones in Montgomery County? How do we answer that as fair policy if we're looking at, if we no longer think open space is the way we want to go, then no one should get those credits. The other impact is, where do we go next by zip code? Are we going to look at the seniors in Leisure World and say they have extra revenue, they don't need it, and their disposable income that we should use to help us with our schools, help us with other issues we have? Yes, we have financial issues, and we have 24 people here who are innovative and intelligent that can come down here and make policy that is fair and across the board, not policy by zip code. Thank you.
Delegate Kelly.
Delegate Queen made some of my points. I couldn't agree with her more. I wasn't going to say anything. But I feel like I have to. I feel like, honestly, this bill comes across to me like a mean-spirited, targeted attack. I don't think it makes sense. I agree with Delegate Barbet that it's a luxury tax. I've never seen the inside of one of these country clubs. Never once. But it seems to me, and I'm certainly hearing from my constituents, that we are really picking and choosing who the bad guys are that we're going to target for a very small amount of money. And when Casey Anderson was here, and he said, you got to welcome the person who's buying that $5 million apartment. There's real money in that. There's real money that these very affluent people who can afford to be inside these country clubs are paying year after year after year when they choose to reside in Montgomery County. About 1% a year on a $2.5 million property. How many houses does it take to account for that $400,000 a year? It doesn't make any sense to me. It is completely unjustified in my mind and a mean-spirited attack. And I really like Delegate Queen's point about who are we going to go after next? Right? So now it's the rich country club going people who, by the way, again, to Chairman Barbet's point, don't mind being taxed when we can point to what it's about. And next year, we're going to come by and say, hey, guess what? We need to raise your taxes for education. Just like the county council came by a couple years ago and said, hey, guess what? We need to raise your property taxes. It's just so frustrating to me because there are a lot of people of goodwill in our community who have the money to be parts of these country clubs who are feeling really attacked. And what we want to do is to share in their values and talk about the community we want to build together, where we can have all of the social justice programs that we want and raise all votes, and we want them on our team, not on our team. And so, to me, I hate to use a cliche, but really the juice is not worth the squeeze. For $400,000, this is not going to solve all of our social ills, but what can is getting the people who have the money on board with big picture policy change, and that's what I'd like to see this delegation doing.
Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the points that I wanted to make have already been made, so I'll keep this brief. But I will reiterate that the tax issue, this is a luxury tax on just a few people. We're not here to discuss whether we should raise income taxes or raise property taxes, but if we want to have that conversation, let's have it in a fair manner, in a broad manner, in a statewide manner. This is a very targeted tax that I believe is absolutely unfair. Secondly, we talked about open space. I won't reiterate that, but for those of you who say I don't get to access this, you don't get to access it, but you do benefit from it. And we hear that every day in our committee. Third, these are businesses. They provide thousands of good paying jobs. The average worker stays there for 12 years. Why do they stay there so long? Because they're really good jobs. So the tax on these businesses will have an impact. What that impact is going to be, none of us know, and I'm not going to say, but just realize it will have an impact. And the last thing I want to say is we talk a lot in this body about local courtesy, and we ask other jurisdictions to give us local courtesy on our own bills. This is a very targeted bill against District 16. 2 of them are in District 16. A lot of our residents belong to the other 2. So I would ask you for local courtesy and vote against this bill.
Delegate Resnick, then Delegate Shetty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have been very frustrated with every iteration of this bill since we've been talking about it last year. And I will preface this by saying that I've gotten hundreds of emails in opposition and support. Of the hundreds of emails that I've gotten, one has been my constituent. So I don't really have a stake in this. That one, by the way, was an employee, not a member of country clubs, who asked me to vote against the bill, who has spent 30 years working at 2 different country clubs, the 2 of the 4 country clubs that are attended. What I do have in my district is a bankrupt country club. Excuse me, not a bankrupt country club, a bankrupt golf course. Didn't have much of a club, it was a little shack of a club. That golf course went bankrupt a number of years ago for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with taxes. And it has been sitting fallow, being argued about back and forth between the county council and residents about what we do with it. In the meantime, it has been overgrown, it has been useless to the county. We have been collecting very little with regard to the benefit that we could. What we are seeing with this bill, though, is it started out as a revenue bill. It started out as $10 million that will solve 1/5 of our county's current budget process, even though they would not have actually been able to get the $10 million in time to solve the budget problems, but that's besides the point. And it has been withered and withered and withered to the point where, frankly, it's just an ideological statement at this point. That's really all it is. $400,000, and I appreciate Delegate Newman saying $4 million, that's over 10 years. You could say over 100 years, it's $40 million. You could say over 1,000 years, it's $400 million. It's $400,000 from 4 clubs. This is no longer an issue of fair taxation. It is simply an ideological poke. It is a scalp. And I excuse the rhetoric, and I apologize for that. But it is an attempt to simply make...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
I apologize. It was an improper statement. But it is a target to make a point. And there's no reason to do this. So I'm voting against the bill. Again, I apologize. I let my mouth get ahead of me. But we're not making any money from this. We're really not doing anything other than, telling 30 protesters in front of a club that being the loudest voice in the room makes good policy, and it doesn't.
Delegate Shetty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sensitive to a lot of the arguments being made here today. 2 of the clubs are in our district as well. And like all of you, we've had hundreds, thousands of emails on both sides of the argument. A couple of questions, if I may ask, of either the bill sponsor or the amendment sponsor. Okay. So one question, again, is regarding the amendment that was adopted, Delegate Stewart's amendment. If all of the $100,000 per total club is passed on to members, about how much per member per year increase are we talking?
So of the 4 clubs that are affected by the bill, they have an average of about 1,000 members. That varies. I think the range is pretty tight. It's like 700 to 1,200 or something like that. We heard from them in the local committee a couple weeks ago. So an annual fee of $100,000, an average of $100,000 per year, an average of 1,000 members. The math is pretty easy. Each member would pay an average about an extra $100 per year if the amount was passed on entirely to the members. And their annual dues range, but they go up to $90,000 or $100,000 a year. So the change would basically be, say, $90,000 a year to $90,100 a year.
Okay, thank you. And do we know how much the annual dues are?
We don't. We tried to ask the country clubs about their annual dues and their initiation fees. They said that the information was proprietary and private, and so they didn't offer. However, the Washington Post has published some of the information. One of the clubs, in fact, Kenwood, actually has information publicly available on their website. The dues, Kenwood actually had $7,000 a year dues, but they have a $90,000 initiation fee. The other three clubs, I think, have a pretty tight range of annual dues, somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 is our best guess. But once again, we're sort of having to rely on third-party data.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you.
Delegate Stewart.
Thank you. I just want to address a few of the comments that have been made, and I do appreciate a lot of the points that have been made. First, to just briefly provide context for the amendment, it was not at all a mean-spirited attack or ideological move or any sort of singling out of anyone. What I was trying to do with this amendment was bring all parties to the table. I actually had an open dialogue, and I really appreciate the representative from the country clubs talking to me as much as he has been talking to me. But really, what it was about for me is almost like a West Wing moment, a Mr. Smith goes to Washington moment, where I, out of my freshman naivete, thought that I could sort of craft a compromise proposal that everyone would like, and we could all hold hands here around the horseshoe and sing Kumbaya. And for a minute there, we were extremely close. I think that actually, contrary to a lot of the comments that hear that, oh, this is a big attack, I'm not, we're all so mean, the country clubs, I think, were extremely close to accepting this compromise because Delegate Moon was willing to end the crusade entirely, and we would have been done with this, and this would have been the sort of final showdown. I'm not trying to single anyone out. In tax policy, a lot of times what you do is means test fees or taxes or whatever you want to call it. There's nothing in the bill about zip codes. It's entirely about property values. We put it at $500,000. We put it at $500,000 as a per acre value. It's a nice even number. If I wanted to single people out, I would have been like, okay, like congressional, they should probably be in the bill. It seems like they can probably afford it. But no, we put it at a reasonable sort of flat, even number, and then we saw what country clubs came back. But usually pilots are much more highly targeted than that. Usually, like when Baltimore City does a pilot, they say, okay, Johns Hopkins, pony up some money for a pilot. You haven't been paying any tax. This church, you guys pony up. This hospital, you guys pony up. So usually when you're talking about pilots, you're talking about actually singling them out with one by one by one. It's unfortunate that there are only 4 clubs. I agree with a lot of the comments that I wish we could do this in a holistic way, but it's whack-a-mole. Last year, Delegate Moon brought a bill to the delegation that would have charged every single club their market rate, and there were 2 big complaints. One, they would have to sell off to developers because the price would be too high, and we would no longer have open space, which is an argument that a few people have made today. And the other argument they made was that some of these clubs are mom and pop independent type clubs that will go under. They will go bankrupt if we do that. And so we came back to the table and said, okay, we hear you. We hear you on both of those points. Let's make sure that we only assess it for the clubs that can afford it. And let's make sure it's an amount that's so infinitesimally small that it would barely even be felt by the membership. Well, now we're hearing that not only that we have 2 problems again. We're singling people out, okay, and that the number's too small. So we can't win. We can, whether we have to apply to everyone, apply to few people, it's too high, it's too little. But at the end of the day, what this is supposed to be about is the clubs that can afford to pay a little bit extra money, so the county can address a little bit of its budget shortfall, should be able to do so. This is not some sort of radical ideological statement. Many jurisdictions across many
Please be respectful of Delegate Stewart. Continue.
Many different jurisdictions across many different states have done things exactly like this. It's not about pleasing mobs. It's not about trying to single out rich people. I've been to these country clubs before. I have friends who are members of country clubs, but it's about targeting people who can afford to pay a little bit extra more so that our county can have a little bit more resources. I tried to have a kumbaya moment and a compromise. I'm sorry that it sort of blew up in our face a little bit, but I did want to emphasize that this was not in any way sort of a mean-spirited attack. And I think that in many ways it was about trying to all come together for a compromise that would benefit all parties. Thank you.
Just a reminder, about 5 minutes, you're all going to meet each other for lots of different things. So, Delegate Wilkins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that we had a rich discussion. I think that generally the members know how they're going to vote on this bill. I'd like to move the previous question.
Is there a second?
Previous question after debate.
Second after.
You can only say move the previous question,
Chairman,
which is what I'm going to do.
Is there a second? Delegate Lukey moved the previous question. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. All in favor of moving the previous question?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Roll call from the top. Delegate Acevedo, are you ready on this one?
Start with the end.
Yes.
I'm sorry, where are we now?
On the bill.
Delegate Barclay?
No.
Delegate Carr? Delegate Chesterfield?
Yes.
Delegate Crutchfield?
No.
Delegate Cullison?
Yes.
Delegate Dumas?
No.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo?
No.
Delegate Gilchrist?
No.
Delegate Kaiser?
No.
Delegate Kelly?
No.
Delegate Lopez?
No.
Delegate Love?
No.
Delegate Lutke?
Yes.
Delegate Moon?
Yes.
Delegate Palakovich Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Chief?
No.
Delegate Queen?
No.
Delegate Resnick?
No.
Delegate Chevy?
Yes.
Delegate Solomon?
Yes.
Delegate Stewart?
Yes.
Delegate Wilkins?
Yes.
No.
All right, how'd we do this here? Mr. Chair, was that 11, 13, or 12, 12?
13, 11.
13, yeah, 11, 13. Yeah, 11.
It failed 13 to 11. Committee announcements. Delegate Carr.
The Metro Washington Committee will be meeting on Monday at 7 p.m. to discuss two bills.
I think that's it for committee announcements, correct? Great. Just a reminder, the LGBTQ MoCo Democrats will be here in HB 318 this afternoon. Return your purple folders. Any other announcements?